Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the move of What If Deku Caught Aizawa's one-night stand? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Objectively, the man looked far too attractive to be talking to Shoyuta. Long, blonde hair framed his face and fell over his shoulders, tucked behind his ears as to not hide the numerous gold and silver piercings he wore. His CRB top displayed the top half of an impressive set of abdominal muscles, and there were patchwork tattoos absolutely covering his left arm and the small sliver of collarbone Shoyuta could see. Vibrant green eyes were half hidden behind dark-rimmed glasses, and oh shit! Was that a tongue ring? Shoyuta was really glad Izuku was staying the night at Emi's that night for some auntie-nephew bonding, in the woman's own words. But, despite the man's outrageously attractive exterior, it had actually been his laugh that drew Shuta's attention. For most of the night, Shoyuta had been sitting at the bar with his whiskey, sipping slowly as he tried desperately to blend into the wooden countertop. Emi had insisted on him getting out and experiencing life for once. Slipping condoms into his wallet, fortunately out of Izuku's line of sight, she had smacked him on the butt and sent him on his merry way to the nearest gay bar with his 5-year-old on her hip. And really, with that kind of interaction, Shoyuta was deeply regretting leaving his kid with the woman. Who knew what kind of terrible things she was teaching the child? Shoyuta, however, was not a people-y type of person. In fact, he was horridly introverted. Teaching kids was different. Them, he could scold and de-escalate. But he couldn't offer to de-escalate the redhead that had been staring at him since he arrived, because that would surely have the opposite of intended effects. Being around other adults was difficult. In fact, ever since Inko had passed away, the only adult Shoyuta had spent time around besides his mother's was Emi. Even though she graduated a few years behind him, the young woman had started teaching at Ketsubutsu Academy before him. After Inko's demise, and taking in Izuku as his son, Shoyuta needed a job other than his underground hero ing to help support a growing child. Emi had somehow remembered Shoyuta and had offered to help him get a job at Ketsubutsu. After getting his teaching license, it was only a matter of Emi cajoling the principal into giving him a job. Shoyuta hadn't been sure what Emi got from helping him and had even asked her point-blank why she was doing so. "You went to UA," she had said. "I was still in middle school when you went through the sports festival. I watched it every year with my moms. And that year, the year that you participated, I got to see a kid with a weird quirk like mine, considered weak and non-heroic, get into the finals. But I didn't win." "No, you didn't," Emi had smiled softly, so different from her characteristic grin. "But you showed me that all of the kids at my school were wrong. I could do great things, like go to UA or be a hero, even with my weird quirk. Because you could." "I didn't make it into the hero course at UA," Shoyuta had reminded her. "No, but neither did I." Emi's smile had taken a turn to a Cheshire grin. "But we both ended up in the hero course at Ketsubutsu. You were just 2 years ahead of me. But I remembered you, Shoyuta, and what you did for me. So now, let me help you." And damn it, when she put it like that, offering up such an innocent, pure motive, Shoyuta had to. Not that Emi hadn't tried to hit on him later, but he'd quickly told her he didn't play for her team, and Emi quickly started trying to get him partnered up with any and all of their male co-workers. And so, Emi had become Shuta's one and only friend. And, honorarily, Izuku's aunt joke. That being said, Shoyuta didn't have much interaction with other adults outside of work. Okay, he had no interaction with other adults outside of work. Which was why this was so difficult for him. Sitting there at the bar, all alone while others danced and drank and made merry even though it was summer. And then Shoyuta heard him. The gorgeous blonde that he was suddenly buying a drink for, sending it across the bar and drawing the other man's attention. The blonde had laughed. He'd laughed, so loud and boisterous and carefree, and it was so different than Emi's quirked laugh. Hers sounded high-pitched and plastic-y. But this laugh? This man's laugh, it sounded like sunshine. It was low-toned yet loud, melodic in a way as it reverberated through the bar. The man had been laughing at something a woman dressed in all black leather next to him had said. She was poking fun at another man, dark-haired and blushing, definitely straight, and the blonde was cracking up. Shoyuta had felt a blush rise to his cheeks, and he'd asked the bartender to top off the man's drink. Unfortunately, the blonde had taken it for the come-on that it was not, absolutely wasn't, because Shoyuta can't talk to the hot blonde, and oh god, he was walking Shuta's way and had strode over to Shuta's side, tucking his hair behind his ear and easily drawing Shoyuta into conversation. This guy was hot. And Emmy was right, damn it, she was right way too often. Shoyuta needed human interaction. Maybe he could ask the blonde on a date? Or for his number at least. They could text. Or something. If Shoyuta could do this. He could ask the hot, gorgeous, sunshine human next to him for his phone number, and then in a couple of days he'd text the man and see how he was doing. Hey! The blonde leaned across the bar, his breath hot on Shuta's cheek as he whispered in his ear, "You wanna get out of here?" And diamen him. Shoyuta was already a few whiskeys in and couldn't stop himself when he said, "My place isn't far." "Good," the blonde chuckled, "'cause mine is. But I wouldn't mind riding there with you. Or riding you at all." Shuta's alcohol blush deepened, and damn it, his crotch was already stirring. Downing the last of his whiskey for courage, Shoyuta stood and grabbed the blonde's collar before grinning and murmuring, "Good. I'll call a cab." Hizashi hadn't been expecting the bartender to refill his drink. To his own chagrin, he was a bit of a lightweight and exceptionally flirty when drunk, so he tried to cut himself off before Namuri could foist him off on the first attractive drunkard she saw. She'd already tried to hook Tensei up with a drag queen, which had ended horribly and hilariously. Tensei was still blushing about it. But then, his drink was suddenly full, and Hizashi was quirking an eyebrow in question to the bartender. They shrugged, gesturing over their shoulder and saying, "Dark-haired one on the end. Looks a little homeless. He didn't leave a message or nothing. Just means you'll have to go talk to him," Namuri teased, and Hizashi rolled his eyes, ready to shut her down. And then he saw him. The dark-haired, certainly not homeless-looking, utter-eating Adonis at the end of the bar. Hizashi choked on a gasp and quickly took a sip of his drink to hide it. Rather than hair, the god sitting at the bar had a pitch-black mane that shined purple in the blue lighting of the bar, curly and wild and pulled halfway up and back to show a bit more. Then stubble on his strong jawline. His eyes were dark, seemingly hooded as he looked down at his own drink. The slightly wrinkled and boy did Hizashi want to wrinkle it more charcoal dress shirt he wore was unbuttoned enough to show his collarbone and some of his chest, and the sleeves were rolled up to show his forearms which, Hizashi's brain helpfully supplied, were muscular and scarred, 2 points in Hizashi's attractive book. "Well," Namuri teased, ping her head and hip. "You gonna leave that poor, CC man to be utterly alone all night?" Choosing to take a sip of his liquid courage, Hizashi, not taking his eyes off the Greek god across the bar, tossed over his shoulder, "Don't wait up, guys." Tensei groaned, "Zashi, please don't leave me with her dash. Don't wait up." Hizashi repeated, darting far away from Namuri's smugness and Tensei's misery as he sidled up next to the man. "Hello, darlin'," he drawled, grinning as he took a sip of his drink. It was something fruity that Namuri had suggested, but Hizashi was suddenly feeling that it was a lot stronger than she had earlier let on. That or being around this fine but specimen was making Hizashi lightheaded. "Thanks for the drink." The man blushed and wasn't that adorable. Hizashi wanted to kiss him and squeeze his bubble butt that sat on the bar stool so beautifully. "Shy are we?" Hizashi chuckled a bit, feeling himself grow slightly bashful. "Well, real sorry about this, but I'm not." Maybe he could get this guy's number? Hopefully he could get into this guy's breeds at the very least, but his number would be good too. Because for all that he hung out with his friends, Hizashi got lonely with just his cat. Noodles was adorable and amazing, but Hizashi wanted love and affection from a human being, not a little demonic terror of the night. Ever since he'd taken on teaching at UA, Hizashi had less and less free time. Working at the station was a dream job, and he adored his students, and being a hero was his life. But 3 jobs were a lot, and there were only so many hours in the day. So Hisashi's dating life had suffered quite terribly, which was the main reason Nomuri had dragged him and Tensei out that night. They'd gone bar hopping all throughout downtown, ending up on the outskirts, closer to a suburban area, when Nomuri had seen the rinky-dink gay bar and club on a street corner near where they'd stopped for a breather. "Zashi, live a little," she teased him. "You've been unbearably clingy recently, sweetheart, but I don't exactly want in your breathes." "Nem," he'd blushed right back. "I haven't been clingy." "Sorry, Zashi," Tensei had rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. "But you kinda have been. I'm flattered at the attention, of course, and I still care about you, but, bro, you've gotta find a boyfriend. Or girlfriend. Or whatever. You just need to get laid, Zashi," Nomuri had taunted, "and that is the perfect place to find some hot, CCD action dash." "Jesus Christ, Nomuri, shut up. Fine. We'll go to the DMN club, happy?" And well, if Nomuri wasn't happy about being at the club, she certainly didn't show it. And Hisashi was certainly happy about it now. Now that he was following Adonis's perky little butt out onto the street, hailing a cab with drink-shaky hands and trying not to jump the man's bones on the way to his apartment. As it were, they hardly got in the front door before Hisashi was lurching forward to kiss him. That being said, the man wasn't leaning away from Hisashi. He seemed a little unsure, even for as deeply as he returned Hisashi's kisses. "You're so hot," Hisashi murmured, kissing along the man's jawline and neck as they shuffled towards what Hisashi assumed was his bedroom. "Jesus, how often do you work out? Your abs are rock solid, dude." "You're seriously calling me dude when we're about to have EC? Yeah, dude. Because your abs are effing amazing." "Well," the man chuckled lowly, his blush rising to his ears, "you can admire them all you want once your clothes are off. Say no more, dude." And really, neither of them said much more that night. When his alarm clock went off, Shoyuta hit snooze. Most of the time, despite being a night owl and despising the rising sun with all of his being, Shoyuta got up on time. He had to get Izuku ready for the day after all, and he was a teacher. He had to be prompt. But Izuku was at Emi's, and Shoyuta was tired and achy and hungover. So, groaning, he smacked at the alarm clock until it shut the hell up. Rolling over, Shoyuta snuggled into the warmth next to him before falling quickly back asleep. Warmth? Eyes snapping open, Shoyuta realized that, in the sleep-addled way he did, he'd suddenly lost hours in what felt like moments between hitting snooze and rolling over into the strong chest of the man he'd brought home last night. Because he could hear the front door opening, could hear Emi's laughter and Izuku's bright giggles, and was it already noon? Yes, it would seem. It was already noon. Because Emi had brought Izuku back home. And there was a naked man in Shuta's bed. "Get up!" Shoyuta hissed, smacking a pillow into the blonde's face. The man sputtered, sitting up slowly and groaning loudly, earning another smack from Shuta's pillow. "Get up!" Shoyuta snapped, earning a groggy blink from the blonde. The man frowned at Shoyuta for a moment before reaching over to the nightstand and grabbing a set of hearing aids. And wow, Shoyuta must have been out of it last night to have not noticed the man taking them out. Then again, he'd been a little bit drunk and a lot bit tired, exhausted and sore from the numerous rounds and positions this attractive, skillful blonde had put him through. He'd certainly been exhausted enough to forget about his effing kid. Or at least, forget about what time his kid was coming home. And then sleep long enough to not be able to kick out his one-night stand. Emi was never going to let him live this down. When the blonde had his hearing aids on, Shoyuta hissed out, "Get dressed. And be quiet. You can go out through the window dash." "The window? Dude, you're on the 3rd floor. Shut up or they'll hear you dash." But the damage was already done. A young, confused voice called out, "Daddy?" And Shoyuta cursed with the fury of 1,000 suns. Because this attractive blonde for making him look like a terrible father. "Daddy?" the blonde asked, looking utterly gobsmacked. "Do you have a effing kid in here?" "He wasn't here last night, idiot," Shoyuta snapped, dragging himself from the bed and pulling on the clothes nearest to him. Picking up the man's CRP top from the night before, Shoyuta pegged it as hard as he could at the blonde's head. "Get dressed, dumbass. As humiliating as it was fortunate that Emi had heard their arguing coming from the bedroom, because she managed to keep Izuku occupied long enough for the two men to get dressed. And it was fortunate that they both had long hair, because between the two of them, there was a total of about 10 visible hickeys. "Are you married?" The man snapped at Shoyuta while trying his best to pull his hair over his collarbone. "Are you effing kidding me?" "I'm not married, you assuming jackass," Shoyuta snarked right back. "Not everyone who has kids is married. And I'm not some cheating effing a hole dash." "No, just a effing a hole then," the blonde offered back in too chipper a joking voice. Shoyuta leveled the same glare at the man that he did with misbehaving students, but the blonde merely rolled his eyes. "Can't scare me, Adonis." "Adonis? Is that better or worse than dude? I can't really tell with you. You piece of dash." It seemed that Emi's distraction had run its course, though, because Shoyuta was just slamming shut his bedside drawer, condoms and accessories hidden away, when a shaggy head of green hair and two bright viridian eyes peered through the suddenly open doorway. Rather than screech like Shoyuta had expected, the blonde took on a crouched stance and grinned at Izuku, tilting his head to the side and waving slightly. "Hi there, kiddo. Good morning." From the living room, Shoyuta could hear Emi's cackling, "It's past noon, oh my god dash," and made a mental note to swh the salt and sugar at the coffee station in the teacher's lounge on Monday. Maybe she could get a laugh out of that. Izuku froze like a deer in headlights. The child's hand was half up, reached out towards his father, while the other held tightly to his all-might blanket, that dreaded, cursed blanket that Shoyuta hadn't been able to find a suitable substitute for, because of course it was his kid that had to love All Might. The boy's eyes flickered back and forth between his father and the blonde before they jumped to the bed and crumpled sheets and pillows that had been tossed on the floor in the men's haste. "Daddy? Did you have a sleepover?" Emi snorted in the living room, still not daring to poke into Shuta's line of sight. And this situation was unprecedented. Again, Shoyuta didn't really do adult interactions. And he'd certainly never had a one-night stand before. But he really didn't want to go about explaining SEC to his 5-year-old when he'd literally just woken up, not with Emi in his living room and an utter stranger in his bedroom. And so, Shoyuta said, yes. Well, it wasn't technically a lie. The blonde had slept over, after all. "Daddy, you had a sleepover with Present Mike. And didn't invite me?" "What?" Emi utterly screeched as Shoyuta whipped his head around to stare at the blonde. And, yeah, if he squinted and tilted his head a bit, he could kinda see it. Present Mike was another of Izuku's favorite pro-heroes, one that he listened to on the radio incessantly. Shoyuta must have been drunker than he thought last night to have not recognized the man's voice, even without whatever radio persona he put on. "Wow. I see you're a big fan, little listener," the blonde, Present Mike cheered to Izuku. "That's really rad that you recognized me." "Yamada," came Emi's now hysteric laughter from the living room. "Oh my god, Shoyuta, Yamada?" Izuku ignored his auntie, thankfully, being rather used to her bouts of hysteria. Turning all of his attention onto Present Mike, Izuku began doing what he did best. Rambling. Shoyuta didn't even feel sorry for the blonde when Izuku's questions piled up and up and up until Present Mike, Yamada, it seemed, was utterly crushed under their weight. Bemused, Shoyuta smirked at the man and watched as Yamada tried his best to answer all of Izuku's questions and not fall over onto his, but in shock at the child's in-depth analysis of what his quirk could do. Little listener, that sure is something. How old did your dad say you were again?" "He's 5, Shoyuta revealed, taking a bit of pity out on the man. "Izuku, take a breath, okay?" The child stopped and did just as his father instructed, and then launched back into another tirade. "Mr. Present Mike Yamada-san." Izuku cheered. "Would you please go to the park with me and Daddy today? Daddy said he was going to take me to the park so we could go to the playground because they just put in new swings, and Daddy said that he would push me on them. And you can yell real loud and scare away any of the birds that try to steal my sandwiches. Because last time we went to the park a bird tried to steal my sandwich and Daddy had to chase it away with his scarf dash." Shoyuta would have reminded his son that his capture weapon was just that, a weapon, and not a scarf to be played with like the child often tried to, but he wasn't quite sure he wanted to reveal his pro identity to the blonde yet. Not that he was well heard of or known by any spotlight heroes save for the ones he worked with, but one couldn't be too careful. And you and Daddy could have a pro-hero team up and go fight the bad guys together. Or not. Yuta sighed out a heavy breath, trying to be patient. It was hard sometimes, patience not always coming natural to him, even after almost 3 years of parenting. He hadn't explicitly told Izuku not to say he was a pro-hero to Yamada, and Izuku was, of course, under the impression that they were friends. Because friends had sleepovers. And really, if should his life, he didn't want to be friends with present Vintik, Emi was loud enough. For what it was worth, Yamada didn't react outrageously to Izuku's proclamation of his father being a pro-hero. Instead, Yamada inclined his head towards Izuku and intoned, "Ah yes. Of course. Your dad's a pro too, I forgot." And sheet, the blonde sounded minutely salty about that, not that he had room to talk anyways, damn it. He's such a cool pro-hero that, erase her head. Izuku chirped. He's the coolest. Even though he's underground, Daddy's the strongest and coolest hero ever. Besides All Might. And you, present Mike. And no, Yuta didn't bristle over that little comment he didn't. Because it was perfectly natural for his kid to have heroes other than him. To us. Even if one of those heroes happened to be his father's most recent and only one-night stand. Yuta would have laughed right along with Emi if he wasn't so mortified and didn't have an image to uphold. Ah, right, Eraserhead, Hisashi said, sounding hesitant. Of course. So? Will you? Izuku finished, and Yuta took the chance to interrupt his son. Kiddo, present Mike and Eraserhead work at different times of day. We likely won't see each other again. Izuku shook his head, his chubby little freckled cheeks puffed out in frustration as he tried to explain himself. No. Not heroes. Today, Daddy. Today? Yuta inquired, ping an eyebrow. The park, Daddy. Can Mr. Present Mike Yamada-san come to the park with us? Zuku, I don't think Yuta started, right as Yamada exclaimed, sure. Utterly bewildered because who wouldn't be in his situation, Yuta turned his head to stare down at Yamada. Sure, he intoned, hoping to imbue his voice with as much disbelief as he was feeling. Yeah, Yamada shrugged, grinning sheepishly. Why not? Anything for a little listener who's as big a fan as Izuku here. The gasp Izuku let out nearly had Yuta lurching for the boy's inhaler. Daddy, Mr. Present Mike Yamada-san knows my name. Yuta wouldn't dare point out to his son that he'd said the boy's name already. He wouldn't crush his child's joy like that. But could he really allow Yamada to just accompany them to the park? Pro-hero or not, Yuta didn't know Yamada. He didn't even know the man's first name. The man he'd slept with the night before. God, Emi was really never going to let him live this down. Realistically, Yuta couldn't allow Yamada to accompany them. He could be any kind of horrible or worse, annoying person that Yuta wouldn't want around Izuku. But the blonde had been answering all of Izuku's questions with ease. Sure, he'd had to catch up a little, but he was indulging Izuku's son. It was honestly kind of a turn-on. And so, with a heavy sigh, he turned to face Yamada fully. Well, Mr. Present Mike Yamada-san, Yuta couldn't help but tease, let's get going. After calming Izuku down enough to put away his notebooks and things from his sleepover at Emi's, Yuta went to get dressed properly and put a bag of snacks and water bottles together. Not a diaper bag, Emi, he's not too. This, unfortunately, gave Yamada, Hisashi, Yuta had been informed enough time to catch up with Emi. Because apparently the two knew each other. And if one of them wasn't enough of a headache, then two of them was a FING migraine. Yuta was saved from the two belting out into a singing contest by the toddling noise of Izuku's stamping feet. The small child entered the living room with his hair in disarray and about a half-dozen toys in his arms. Swiftly, kicking Emi's feet away from his as he went, Yuta stood from the couch and crouched down to heft his kid up onto his hip, blatantly ignoring Yamada's odd staring. Kiddo, you can't take all of these with us, Yuta told Izuku, earning a pout from the child. One toy, Izuku. You can play with the others later. Because Shoyuta didn't want to have to keep track of all of Izuku's favorite toys. Because he was surely to lose one, and he really didn't want to deal with a meltdown today. When Izuku opened his mouth to object, Shoyuta tapped the boy's nose with a finger and repeated, "One, Izuku." Pouting, but no longer objecting, Izuku ran back to his room, toys in hand. Shoyuta heard the telltale thudding of the boy's toy chest opening and shutting, and he fought hard not to smile to himself. Izuku was a good kid. Shoyuta had really lucked out. His tantrums were few and far between, even if his crying meltdowns were a bit more common. And the kid cleaned up after himself. From what Shoyuta had heard of other children, that was a miracle in of itself. Emi and Yamada were ramping up once more, and Shoyuta fought the urge to flare his quirk at the two and yell for them to shut up. He was saved by Izuku once more, however, when the little boy rushed back into the room with a single toy in hand. Abruptly, Shuta's good mood dropped. Because Izuku had, of course, chosen his present mic action figure. Fighting down the sigh that was building behind his chest, and the headache that was beginning in the base of his skull, Shoyuta rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, "Oh, kiddo. Say bye to Emi." Whereas Izuku would typically pout at Emi's departure, the child merely hugged his aunt and chirped, "Bye-bye, auntie joke." Shoyuta absolutely took pleasure in the slight disappointment in Emi's eyes when she didn't have time to hug Izuku back, and then the child was bounding over to Yamada and grabbing the man's hand, tugging and tugging until Yamada stood from the couch and stumbled after the child. Izuku brought Yamada over to stand right next to Shoyuta even as he moved the toy at the blonde man. Look, Mr. Present Mike Yamada-san. It's you." "It is." Yamada had the utter audacity to grin dopily and beam down at Shuta's child, making the underground hero's stomach flutter. He quickly tamped down on those absolutely not emotions, choosing to definitively not deal with them later. "Wow, little listener. This one is a really old one, back from when I was first starting out. How'd you get a hold of it?" As Shoyuta led Yamada and Izuku out the front door, not so subtly kicking Emi's shin as she exited past him, giggling up a storm, he listened to his kid regale Yamada with the tales of his 4th birthday. It had been a rough one, certainly, what with Izuku being disappointed about his quirk not coming in. So Shoyuta may have gone a little overboard on the presents, but it wasn't a big deal. Izuku could do with a tiny bit of spoiling every once in a while, especially with how often Shoyuta was out working. And the man certainly felt guilty about that. Being an underground hero and a teacher took a lot out of his days. At night, he would patrol while Izuku's regular babysitter, a sweet young woman who was working on her teaching degree and was a very vocal advocate for quirkless rights, watched him until late into the evening. Around 1 to 2 am, Shoyuta would appear at home to pay Hanako, make sure she got out to her car, and check in on Izuku. He would then promptly fall into bed and get a few meager hours of sleep before waking up to get Izuku ready for the day. Izuku went to a school further away than usual, which meant they had to take the subway to get there, but Shoyuta wouldn't trade the boy's gloriously wonderful and accepting teacher for any other. Aldra Elementary School had been absolutely horrid, and it had taken only 1 week before Shoyuta was withdrawing Izuku from their curriculum and shutting down any and all ties with the Bakuga family that they'd previously had. The Bakugas may have been friends with Inko, but Shoyuta wouldn't stand for their kid bullying and assaulting Izuku. Especially for something as ridiculous as not having a quirk. Which, now that he thought about it as he hailed a cab, Shoyuta was concerned about for their day. Because Yamada seemed like the chatty type, and Izuku was too when he was comfortable. Shoyuta wasn't sure whether he was happy or angry that Izuku seemed to already be comfortable with Yamada, but given that the man was present mic, he'd let it slide. But now that Yamada knew Izuku's age, the topic of quirks was more than likely to come up. Especially when Izuku was already so fond of quirk theory, even though he could only talk about it in the most basic of terms. What would Yamada's reaction be when he heard Izuku was quirkless? Shoyuta wasn't a wishful kind of man, choosing instead to rely on cold, hard facts. But as he looked over at Yamada opening the door to the cab for Izuku, helping the child shuffle inside, Izuku beaming up at Yamada like the man hung the sun in the sky. Well, Shoyuta couldn't help but hope. Getting to the park was easy. The cab driver was politely quiet the whole way there, which Shoyuta appreciated, given the Yamada and Izuku were talking at 1,000,000 miles an hour about JSL? Yamada was teaching Izuku a few signs in JSL. And even with the clumsy hands of a small child, Izuku was taking to it like a duck to water. It gave Shoyuta pause for a moment. Maybe teaching the kid JSL would have been better in the early days. Maybe it would have caused less strife on Izuku's quiet days, the days when he could hardly nod yes or no, much less speak. But it wouldn't do to dwell on the past. There was nothing to be done for it, and they'd figured things out eventually. Shoyuta had figured out quickly how to read Izuku's moods. He could tell when the child was too anxious to speak, too upset to convey his emotions properly, and even happier than a lark. The whole happier than a lark would apply now. While the kid was talking to present Jesus, Shoyuta thought, running a hand down his face as he tipped their cab driver rather generously. Thanks, he said dryly, the cabbie tipping his hat back and grinning like a loon before driving away. Turning around, Shoyuta took in the sight of Yamada crouching next to his son, beaming at the child just as Izuku had been beaming at him before. Yamada had tugged a dandelion from the ground and was explaining how to make a wish on it to Izuku, the child's eyes wide with wonder. Shoyuta had to tamp down on a smile. It wasn't cute. It wasn't. Yamada was an unknown factor, unknown territory that could be a terrible influence on Izuku. But, while he stood there watching Yamada teaching his son how to wish on a dandelion, Shoyuta couldn't help but think that the man meant no harm. Not to Shuta's kid, and maybe not even to Shoyuta. And then Yamada's gaze turned to Shoyuta, and he winked, and Shoyuta felt a blush rising to his cheeks, curse his pale complexion, as he quickly turned towards the park. Reaching a hand out for Izuku to take, the child taking it without complaint, having long since learned to do so, Shoyuta began a slow walk towards the park. Shoyuta had learned early on that Izuku was prone to distractions, and, especially with being small for his age, had trouble keeping up if Shoyuta used his usual long-legged stride. And so, Shoyuta walked slowly. Yamada stood on Izuku's other side, still talking to the child about wishes and weeds. What did you wish for, buddy? Yamada asked him. Shoyuta tensed up, not knowing what to expect from his child. But then, oh so innocently, Izuku said, I wished for ice cream after the park. Slyly glancing up at his father, Izuku said in the sweetest of voices, Daddy, please. Fighting the urge to roll his eyes, Shoyuta said, Maybe, Izuku. They'd reached the edge of the playground, and Shoyuta nodded out towards the swing set. Swings now or later, kiddo? Thinking it over for a moment, a little hand on his littler chin, Izuku murmured, Later. I wanna go play heroes now. Then go play heroes, Shoyuta told his kid, nudging Izuku towards the grassy area next to the playground. Yamada-san can come play too? Izuku asked the hero, who beamed down at Izuku. They'd fortunately established in the cab ride over that Izuku didn't have to refer to Yamada as Mr. Present Mike Yamada-san, even as adorable as it was. If it's okay with your dad, then sure. Daddy. Izuku turned wide eyes towards his father, and Shoyuta bit the inside of his cheek. Oddly enough, the protective instincts inside of him lay dormant when Izuku was around Yamada. Maybe it was because he knew the other man was also a pro-hero. But then again, Shoyuta knew some pretty shitty pro-heroes. Sure, Izuku, Shoyuta shrugged. Go have fun. Izuku cheered before dragging Yamada off towards the playground, rambling on and on about how Izuku was going to play as All Might and Yamada could be a villain. It was honestly adorable, even if Shoyuta still sat on a nearby bench with his arms crossed. He was not pouting though. Absolutely not. Izuku could play heroes with someone else if he wanted to. Shoyuta wasn't jealous. It was a little concerning, though, how quickly Izuku took to Yamada. Yamada, of course, had done nothing wrong, Shoyuta was begrudged to admit, and had been nothing but polite and kind the entire while. Really, Shoyuta had been the one to tug the a-holetry out of the man that morning. And Shoyuta very well probably would have reacted the same way as Yamada if their roles had been reversed. So, no, it wasn't anything Yamada had done that was concerning Shoyuta. It was Izuku. What with how skittish and shy he was around other kids, he was confident and inquisitive around adults. Rather, pro-heroes. The boy was a different person around the few pros that Shoyuta had the misfortune of introducing him to. Gang Orca, best genist, Ms. Joke of course, endeavor which had ended in tears, an absolute shitshow. For being an underground hero, Eraserhead had worked alongside quite a few spotlight heroes. It would make sense that Izuku was more comfortable with heroes, endeavor notwithstanding, seeing as how he'd been around Shoyuta for the entirety of his formative years. And Shoyuta had, of course, been nothing but kind to the boy, even in his own standoffish way. When Izuku had come under Shuta's guardianship after Inko, well, Shoyuta had been forced to do the opposite of what was suggested. He'd put on the kitty gloves, in order to raise Izuku. Izuku had been an emotional mess when Shoyuta got him, even for a 2-year-old. He cried constantly, flinched at any motion from Shoyuta, and was an absolute recluse at nursery school. It had taken literal years, and a lot of hard work, to get Izuku to where he was now. And even then, the boy still flinched around kids his age. Shoyuta only had Aldra Elementary to thank for that. He'd been trying to build a case against them, a lawsuit, but nobody wanted to work towards helping the little quirkless kid. Only Emi and Izuku's babysitter seemed as indignant about it as Shoyuta, although the two were also the next closest thing Izuku had to family besides Shuta's mother's. In the field across from the playground, Izuku pretended to punch Yamada's shin, and the man did a rather dramatic staggering fall to the ground, reaching out a hand as if begging Izuku for mercy. Izuku seemed to think it over for a minute before nodding emphatically, reaching a hand out to Yamada, who took it with a wide grin, hefting himself up off the grass and ruffling Izuku's hair. True to form, Izuku leaned into the contact with a loud giggle. Shoyuta didn't bother hiding his small smile, knowing the two were too far away to see it. So he was a little soft for his kid, so what? The air around Shoyuta shifted, and a presence sat to his right at the far end of the bench. An elderly woman sighed gently as she sat, bringing a baggie of what appeared to be birdseed from her pocket. She turned and scattered the seed behind the bench, and Shoyuta surreptitiously slid a bit further to the left, his smile fading in the presence of a stranger. Satisfied with her work, the woman turned back around and tapped her walking cane against the ground, smiling as she stared out over the field with glass-colored eyes. Her gaze turned toward Shoyuta, then out to where his line of sight was, at Izuku and Yamada. "Are those two yours?" she asked him, her voice weathered and gentle. "The boy's hair looks much like yours, I dare say." Izuku wasn't biologically Shuta's, but the man really didn't want to get in on that sort of conversation with a stranger. Instead, he grunted out, "The boy's mine." The man, "Not so much." It was at that very moment that Yamada leaned down to heft Izuku up, raising the child above his head in an only slightly impressive display of strength that had Shoyuta near blushing. Yamada whirled Izuku around, seemingly singing something to the child as Izuku's whole body was racked with giggles. Eventually, the giggling was shaking Izuku too much to where Yamada had to set him down on the grass. Immediately, the boy flopped backwards onto his back, breathing for air. Yamada laid down about a yard away from him, pointing up at the sky and making the JSL sign for bunny. "Well," the old woman said with a low chuckle, "I dare say he gets along quite fine with your child. Perhaps making him yours would be best, before someone else snatches him up." "A young man?" Before Shoyuta could stop blushing and blue-screening, the woman stood and left. Ping an eyebrow at the odd interaction, Shoyuta watched her walk away until she got to the edge of the park, getting on a bus and riding away. "Odd," he murmured to himself. But then two tiny hands were suddenly on his knees, and Shuta's attention was turned to his son's wide-eyed gaze. "Daddy, swings now?" Shoyuta frowned slightly and replied, "Swings now?" And Izuku rolled his eyes. Shoyuta knew that the action came from himself, a learned behavior, but he was choosing to blame Emi. "Swings now, please?" "Yes, Izuku, we can go to the swings." Shoyuta had thought that pushing Izuku on the swings in the presence of Yamada would be an awkward affair. However, it was anything but. Yamada took the empty swing next to Izuku, lightly kicking himself forward and back as he continued to engage Izuku in conversation. Yamada even put forth the effort to try and engage Shoyuta as well, and Shuta's one-word and grunted answers did nothing to deter the man in his questioning. The only person near his age to have ever treated Shoyuta like anything other than a chore or a bother was Emi. The man had to admit, he was a lot of a recluse and a loner when he didn't have about 4.5 whiskeys in him. Antisocial would only be touching the tip of the iceberg in describing Shoyuta. And yet, Yamada tried. And more than tried, he seemed happy to try. With a carefree grin and a laugh, Yamada spoke to Shoyuta and spoke to Shuta's kid like he'd known them for years, not hours. He talked everything and anything under the sun with Izuku, listening to the kid spout random facts. Mr. Yamada, did you know that butterflies come from cocoons? They sleep for a long time and then pop out all pretty. And middle school level quirk assessments. It was all so domestic, which should have been much weirder than it actually was. Shoyuta found himself comfortable in Yamada's presence. Yeah, quite odd indeed. Aizawa was definitely the stoic, brooding type. It wasn't the type that Hizashi typically went for. He'd had a short stint of dating Fukukado, actually, before the two realized they were better off just as friends. But that was Hizashi's type, bubbly, friendly, extroverted. Aizawa seemed to be the exact opposite of everything Hizashi had always qualified as his type. But maybe he could branch out a bit. And then, watching Aizawa's small, gentle smile as he pushed his son on the swing set, Hizashi's heart twanged and he thought, oh, yeah, he could definitely stand to branch out a bit. But would Aizawa be okay with casual dating? He'd been okay with a one-night stand, it seemed, but something told Hizashi that it was uncharacteristic of the man. Maybe it was the fact that Aizawa seemed so attached to Emi, even as he'd shooed the woman out of their apartment. Maybe it was the way he'd snuggled up to Hizashi all morning, even as he treated him with distaste at the least once Izuku had arrived home. Maybe Hizashi was just empty, eluding himself into thinking that he could make something work with a single dad who seemed to hate his guts. Because Aizawa had yet to do anything but glare at Hizashi while all of his tenderness was focused on Izuku. Right up until that moment that Hizashi had caught Aizawa staring at him and Izuku, crouched on the ground with a dandelion between them. Hizashi had seen the weeds and gotten the idea, eagerly instructing Izuku like the child was one of his students. And Izuku was a brilliant child. The way he spoke about all of the random tidbits of knowledge he had and the way he'd immediately taken to Hizashi's mini JSL lesson had spoken volumes. Izuku was a brilliant, bright child. And from the way Aizawa had gazed upon them, crouched by the weeds, Hizashi thought that maybe that brilliant brightness had been cultivated by the most jaded man he'd met since he looked in a mirror the night before. Maybe Aizawa had brightness in himself too. When Izuku started talking quirk assessments, Hizashi couldn't help but grin and theorize right back. Of course, Izuku chose to break down his father's quirk, it probably being the one he knew best. Because Izuku was only 5, he wouldn't have a grasp on his own quirk for another few years or months, perhaps, with how bright this child was. And erasure seemed like a FING rad quirk. One that could counter Hizashi's misuses of voice perfectly. Shut up, brain, we're not gonna serenade a guy for his FANG quirk, damn it. That's so effed up. And what with all of the talk on quirk theory, even in a child's simplest terminology, although Izuku seemed to have the concepts down-packed, Hizashi couldn't help but wonder if Izuku had inherited his father's quirk. Or some type of crazy amalgamation of his father's and biological mother's, if quirk doomsday theory had any hold. So, it was innocently that Hizashi asked, "What's your quirk, little listener?" And Izuku's face crumpled. When Shoyuta was young, he never would have imagined himself as a father. Especially not with the example of his own father. And his mothers were godsends, really, having raised Shoyuta from age 10 on with a combination of Michiko's fiery boisterousness and Yumi's quiet mulishness. Shoyuta would never give up his mothers, not for the world. And then entered Inko Midoriya. Inko was older than Shoyuta, out of high school and married, but still very young. She lived in the house next door, a stay-at-home wife while her husband was out all hours of the day and night. And when his mothers asked the young woman to babysit Shoyuta while they were working, the 10-year-old only objected a small bit. Because one look at Inko told Shoyuta everything he needed to know. Inko was lonely, just like Shoyuta had been, back before his mothers. drifting for 2 years through the foster system, and even before that, when hiding in closets and being locked in cellars took up the vast majority of his life. So, after only a sideways glance from Yumi, Shoyuta grew quiet. Because he knew that Inko needed him as much as he did her. And so, Inko Midoriya became an older sister of sorts. She would watch Shoyuta while Yumi and Michiko were at work, and she would join them twice a week for dinners. That twice a week drifted down to once a week after Inko got her evening job, of course, but she always continued to make time for Shoyuta and the Aizawas. Inko was there when Shoyuta entered high school, consoling him when he didn't pass UA's hero entrance exam with ice cream and a Studio Ghibli movie marathon. Then again, she comforted him when he was denied entry to the hero program through the sports festival, his second place win not being enough to convince the school board a child with a villainous quirk could be a hero. And once more, Inko was there to celebrate with them when Shoyuta transferred over to Ketsubutsu, acing the hero exam with flying colors. And then Inko became PRDNT. It happened when Shoyuta was in his last year of high school, far too old for a babysitter but unwilling to pull away from his big sister. Inko came over one night, happy tears in her eyes, and handed over a small black and white photograph. "You see, Shosho," she teased him, sniffling and giggling. "You're going to be an uncle." Shoyuta decided then and there that he would be the best uncle. He stated as much to Inko, who giggled again and ran a hand through his hair, long enough now to pull into a low bun and subsequently be mussed up by Inko's gentle hands. It typically irritated Shoyuta to no ends, but he relented that night, too in bliss by osmosis of Inko's own joy. Yumi and Michiko spoiled Inko, of course, but Shoyuta spent nearly every penny of his allowance on gifts for the baby and for Inko. He bought Inko lotions and bath salts to help with her aches and pains, and he bought plushie, after teething ring, after blanket, after everything and anything for the baby. And when Inko found out it was a boy, the Aizawas threw her an entire party, even inviting Inko's friend Mitsuki and her husband Masu, their newborn baby of their own, Ketsukito. It had been a good night, Shoyuta remembered, full of joy and laughter. It was one of Shuta's best memories of Inko, one of the people he was most fond of in life. And when Izuku Midoriya was born, small and underweight, but ultimately healthy, Shoyuta found a new tiny being to be fond of. Izuku was adorable, all pink skin, button nose, and 20 tiny fingers and toes. Shoyuta hardly ever put him down. Even when Shoyuta graduated high school and moved away to go to university, he would return home every weekend to visit his mother's, Inko, and, most importantly, now, Izuku. Even for all that he was still small, Izuku grew like a weed. Before Shoyuta knew it, the freckled baby was crawling and babbling and driving Inko crazy. On top of being cute, Izuku was so incredibly bright. The baby was always laughing, always smiling, always being cheery and treating his Uncle Sho to a gummy grin. It made Shoyuta slowly, gradually, begin to reconsider his swearing off children. It was when Izuku was about a year old that Inko began to grow quieter. She withdrew, only a little at first, pushing their weekly dinners to every other week. And then once a month. And then none at all. Despite this, Inko would never begrudge Shoyuta of his time with Izuku. Dutifully, every weekend, Inko would drop Izuku off with his uncle and honorary grandmothers, returning to her house to have some quality time with her husband. Shoyuta often wondered, if Izuku hadn't been in his life, if school hadn't been distracting him, would things have turned out different? Would Shoyuta still be Izuku's dear uncle, and not his beloved father? Would Inko still be alive? Because it was during one of those weekends Shoyuta was visiting and watching Izuku that the Midoriya house was set ablaze. Upon the first scent of smoke and the sound of the fire alarm going off next door, Shoyuta was handing Izuku off to his mother's, the baby beginning to whine at Shuta's sudden disappearance. Out the door the hero rushed, grasping his capture scarf as he entered the cracked door of the neighboring house. The flames were already consuming the kitchen and living area and were creeping up the steps. The steps that Shoyuta rushed up, entering the MSTR bedroom without pause. Inko's body was lying on the ground, the carpet around her untouched by flames. And yet she was shriveled up and blackened, burnt to an utter crisp. The smell of burnt flesh had made Shoyuta and he threw up on his own feet when everything hit him. Hisashi Midoriya had a fire quirk, and he was nowhere to be seen. The police and emergency services had arrived shortly thereafter, and the Aizawa house was hardly even touched by the flames. The Midoriya house, however, was burnt to the ground. The fire starting at the base of the house had caused it to collapse, and Shoyuta had barely escaped with his life. He hadn't been able to touch Inko's body, much less carry it outside. She didn't even get a proper burial, and it was Hisashi Midoriya's fault. For a long time, Shoyuta was angry, downright furious. He poured everything he had into finding Hisashi Midoriya and putting him behind bars, but even succeeding in that hadn't been enough. He ripped into villains like a madman, putting them in hospitals rather than prisons. Tsukachi, a recent somewhat friend of his, had tried to talk him down. But ultimately, it was his mother's that got to him. What do you think this will do to Izuku in the long run? Michiko had been uncharacteristically quiet. You know that we love Izuku and we love fostering him, but Inko's will requested that you raise him. We're old, Shoyuta. Yumi had spoken softer to her son, but with no less severity. We're old, and Izuku needs someone he can count on. Someone he can count on to come home to him after a long patrol. Can you be the one that offers that to him, or will you lose him forever? In the end, there was no question about it. Shoyuta would rather die than lose Izuku. Or rather, Shoyuta would live for Izuku. And so, he became a father. Shoyuta settled down as much as one could settle with a newly turned 2-year-old, and finished getting his degree in law and ethics. He grew closer to Emi Fukukado, growing a friendship with her and a relationship reminiscent of his with Inko. Emi was a little sister to Shoyuta, and a wonderful anti-joke to Izuku. And then, when Izuku turned 4, he was diagnosed as quirkless. Shoyuta hated that word. Diagnosed. Not quirkless. No, there was nothing wrong with being quirkless. Shoyuta fought quirkless himself, relying on his strength in hand-to-hand combat rather than a flashy quirk. But calling Izuku's quirklessness diagnosable was abhorrent. There was nothing inherently wrong with Shuta's son just because he didn't have a goddamn quirk. But other people didn't see it that way. God, how Shoyuta had been blind to quirkless discrimination and hatred before he'd had a quirkless son. But now, Shoyuta would no longer be blind. He raised Izuku the best he could, cutting ties with the Bakugas when Katsuki became utterly violent against Izuku. He moved Izuku's schools until he found one that would not only accept, but also foster and raise the quirkless child's knowledge. Yes, Shoyuta wanted to see his son grow. He wanted to see Izuku grow up happy and healthy. And now, watching Izuku's face crumple at Yamada's question, Shoyuta wondered if he'd really saved his son from a painful life. If he had done enough to help save Izuku from the pain and the discrimination and the horridness of other people. If he'd done good enough to help the most important person in his life. Shoyuta could only hope. As soon as the words left Hisashi's mouth, he wished he could take them back. Because Izuku looked absolutely crushed, and Hisashi was immediately reminded that the world was a cruel, cruel place. He himself was a product of it, after all. From birth he'd had his quirk. It had deafened his parents, the doctor, and himself upon first cry, earning him a place in an orphanage very, very young. Much of Hisashi's childhood was repressed, and he absolutely didn't remember anything before his first 5 years of life, which was probably for the best. He was honestly surprised he was still alive with what happened in the following years, but there were a few things that stuck out to him. Being swatted with yardsticks by his teacher in class when his voice rose too loud. Being made fun of by the other kids for being too much and yet not enough. Being told he'd never be adopted if he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Being muzzled and locked in a cellar for days on end. That was the worst memory, of course. Hisashi still had the scars to show for it whenever he shaved too. The puckering beneath his chin from where metal had cut too deeply into skin when he tried to speak, tried to cry, tried to breathe. And, true to what his caretakers had told him would happen, Hisashi was never adopted. He aged out of the system and, upon entering college, took refuge surfing couches. The Idas were particularly kind, allowing Hisashi to stay with them for nearly an entire year before Tensei graduated ahead of Hisashi and ended up moving out himself. They'd insisted Hisashi was always welcome, but something about Tensei no longer living under the same roof made Hisashi feel like he was taking advantage. He was still in school, though, and the dorms were expensive as all hell. He'd been complaining about it to Nomuri at the teacher's lounge of UA during their tenure as teaching assistants there. I mean, I only have a few months left anyways, and then I'll be able to afford an apartment myself, but until then he looked down. I'm not sure what I'll do. Nomuri looked distraught, reaching out to squeeze her friend's shoulder. If she hadn't been staying at the dorms herself, she would have offered him a place to stay. And yet, she couldn't. But Hisashi wouldn't ask that of her anyways. Nomuri and Tensei had already done so much for Hisashi. They'd kept him alive through high school, bringing him lunches when his caretakers forgot to fill the fridges and giving him rides to and from his supposed home. They'd kept him alive in other ways as well. In midnight phone calls and in skipping classes, eyes always full of tears, lungs too full of pain to be able to breathe. They'd kept him alive and safe, and they'd helped him start to heal. It was at that opportune moment, that time of weakness for Hisashi, that an angel appeared. Or rather, a not bear. A maybe stoat if you would. None other than Hisashi's homeroom teacher recently promoted to school principal dropped down through a vent in the ceiling. Only years of training kept Hisashi from screeching out the windows of the teacher's lounge. Yamada-kun, I have been made aware that you need a place to stay, no? Nomuri snorted. Made aware. I'll be fine, Ned-sensei, Hisashi chortled back, putting on airs for his old teacher. Please, don't worry about anything, I'll be just fine. Yamada-kun, I have long since been thinking about installing a small dormitory on campus for students in need. It is something that should have been done years ago. The silent, something I wish I could have done for you, nearly brought tears to Hisashi's eyes. Alas, I have no volunteers within my staff for a den mother of sorts. Would you be interested in striking a deal to assist me, Yamada-kun? Sure, Nedzu-sensei, came Hisashi's immediate reply, his voice cracking. That sounds nice. And so, for the rest of his time in university, Hisashi lived on UA's campus. There were only ever 2 students who needed a place to stay at the dorm, and only temporarily for both. But Hisashi stayed on campus all the same, offering after-school tutoring and training sessions for students before retiring to his small, apartment-like room at the base of the dorm. Even after moving out, finding his own apartment, and earning his own living, Hisashi still returned to the dorm whenever temporary occupants passed through. It was one way that the man tried to pay his old teacher back. Because Hisashi had never been able to thank Nedzu properly for helping him. He tried to offer up a check to the maybe stoat at one point in time, but Nedzu had flat out refused him. It was only after months and months of trying that Nedzu finally sat Hisashi down and said, "You want to repay me, Yamada-kun? Very well. Come and teach at UA." And so, all was well that ended well. Hisashi had a job and a home and a family with Tensei, Nomuri, the UA staff, and Nedzu. It was more than he could have asked for. So yes, Hisashi knew of the world's cruelty. But he also knew of the world's light. The sunshine and the happiness and the laughter. And he could see that light inside of little Izuku, could see it trying its best to burn bright. But seeing the light as it were meant that Hisashi could see the very moment his words snuffed it out. No, not snuffed it out. The light was still there, just dimmed. Hidden behind protective hands, hands that were trying to keep it from dying. Izuku was shielding his light, and Hisashi had a duty to the boy. A duty brought on by being the one to put up that wall. A duty brought on by being a teacher and a mentor. A duty brought on because he was here. He was here and in the presence of such a bright, luminescent child, who just needed a little push. Izuku stuttered, staring down at his little hands where they were wringing at each other. Aizawa's own hand snuck forward, allowing itself to be used as a fidget for the child's nervousness. I don't have one. Izuku mumbled, the words barely caught by Hisashi's hearing aids. Oh, sweetheart, Hisashi wanted to cry. Because the world may not have been kind to him because of his quirk, but the world was downright cruel to the quirkless. Hisashi stilled in his light swinging, pulling himself off the swing set and crouching down in front of Izuku. Next to him, Aizawa tensed up, looking ready for a fight to break out. It almost would have made Hisashi laugh, had he not been so focused on the little boy in front of him. What should he say next? He had been quiet for too long already. What could he say? Sorry was out of the question and rude, and that SC kiss was downright offensive even if it was true. And so, Hisashi said what came naturally. Wow, little listener. You are so flipping cool. The enthusiastic reply made Izuku jump, and his eyes flickered up to Hisashi, his tears shocked away. Behind Hisashi, Aizawa was completely still even as his hand in Izuku's shook minutely. What? Izuku croaked, looking downright astounded. Yeah. You're a certified badass, little dude. Hisashi replied again, doing his best to sound natural and excited both at once. Poor little Izuku just looked confused, and Hisashi leapt to explain. Look, kiddo, a lot of people in the world have quirks, right? Why yeah. So, statistically speaking, not having a quirk is rarer. Right? Slowly, still not following Hisashi's logic, Izuku nodded. Okay. So, little listener, not having a quirk makes you special. It means that you have something not a lot of other people have, yeah? Something about Hisashi's reasoning must have hit the child then, because Izuku's eyes lit up even as the rest of his body was still hesitant. Slowly but surely, those hands were retreating from around that light within the boy. Why yeah? Izuku chirped back. I'm special, right, Daddy? Hisashi could have melted from the tone of voice that spewed from Aizawa's mouth. Full of warmth and softness and utter adoration, Aizawa spoke to his son. Yes, Izuku. You are very special. Especially to me. And then Izuku's tears were replaced with giggles. Bright, melodic giggles that sent a wave of relief washing over Hisashi. He sat back on his haunches, grinning ear to ear as Izuku, still holding his father's hand hostage to his chest, began a tangent about all of the facts he knew about quirkless people, as well as mentioning some of the older quirkless people he'd met and made friends with. Well, it could have been much, much worse, to say the very least. This blonde FNG BSDRD. How dare he be good with Shura's child? How dare he not be a quirkist piece of shit and actually a decent human being? How dare he laugh and be a ray of utter FA sunshine as he giggled along with Shura's son? Shoyuta wanted to jump his FING bones. Reeling in that feeling, Shoyuta quickly assessed the situation. Izuku was no longer crying or looking crushed. In fact, he was utterly gleeful as he told Yamada all about the baker down the street from their apartment who was quirkless and made the best chocolate croissants. Yamada was nodding along, laughing and cooing and grinning at all the right places. Shoyuta felt like a boss in a video game, one that was getting all of his weak points hit one by this utter FNG hole of an angel. Sure, not being quirkist was a plus, and a big one at that, but Yamada was so much more than not quirkist. On a surface level he was attractive, sure. Still in his clubbing clothes, but managing to put on a casual face and countenance that put Shoyuta and Izuku at ease. Not to forget, the man was funny. Shoyuta had a reputation to uphold, so he didn't laugh, but Yamada was funny. Much funnier than Emi, although Shoyuta would take that sentiment to his grave. Yamada was a social butterfly, so kind and so thoughtful. The back of Shura's mind was almost bitter about that, wondering if Izuku would have been better off with someone more like Yamada, but he cut that train of thought off as soon as possible. His therapist would disapprove. Shoyuta wanted to get to know Yamada more and more. If you're so excited about Tanaka-san's croissants, Shoyuta drawled, gaining the attention of his son and, not a crush, Shoyuta told the little Emi that lived inside his brain. Yamada, why don't we go get some? Izuku squealed, stomping his little feet in place. Croissants and ice cream? Shoyuta winced, but he didn't want to put any kind of damper on his kid's day. Not when it was going so well. One scoop, Izuku. And then Izuku was turning back to Yamada, squealing, what kind of ice cream do you like, Mr. Yamada-san? Before Yamada could reply, Shoyuta was standing and scooping his child up off the ground, playfully holding Izuku's knees tightly as he swung the little boy upside down. Izuku shrieked with mirthful giggles, and Shoyuta couldn't help but smile. Well, Yamada, Shoyuta said aloud, finding himself in the curious situation, once again, of asking his one-night stand to have a playdate with him and his son. "Are you coming?" Phew. Hisashi's brain was stuck like a broken record. Because that smile. He could die. He could die happy right here and now, because even if Izuku's giggles were cute, they tied right up there with Aizawa's gentle little smile as he played with his son. Swinging Izuku upside down, Aizawa tickled the boy's stomach as his shirt rode down, and Izuku shrieked at a volume that could put Hisashi to shame. But then Aizawa was turning to him, asking him if he was coming with them to get ice cream and croissants. How could Hisashi say anything but a loud and enthusiastic, "Of course." Aizawa's smile briefly widened before he was turning around, swinging Izuku to sit up on his hip. NF-. Hisashi was so screwed. After getting their ice cream at a little parlor next to the park, and after enduring the argument of whether or not mint chocolate chip was a valuable flavor or a downright toothpaste, Hisashi followed Aizawa and Izuku back towards the street corner where Aizawa called a cab. If the ride to the park had been agonizingly long, the ride to the bakery, a mere block away from Aizawa's apartment, was terribly short. The whole while there, Hisashi continued on his JSL lesson with Izuku, although this time differed in that Aizawa himself even joined in their lessons. He took to the sign swimmingly, and the man blushed, turning to look out the window absolutely not nonchalantly when Hisashi praised him. "I took a few classes in high school," Aizawa muttered back, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's nothing too impressive." "I beg to differ," Hisashi countered, winking and then grinning when Aizawa's blush deepened. All too soon, Hisashi's teasing had to come to an end when the cab came to a stop and the driver announced they had arrived. Getting out of the cab, turning to help Izuku hop out, because he was so fing tiny, just absolutely pocket-sized, Hisashi offered his hand to help Aizawa exit the cab as well. And then Aizawa's blush was back, even more furiously red than before, as the man acquiesced and allowed Hisashi's hand to touch his own, pulling him from the back seat. It was ironic and so hilarious that Aizawa was so averse to touching him, so blushy and embarrassed about it, considering everything they'd done the night before. But Hisashi wouldn't dare call him out on it. After all, that would have given Aizawa the in to make fun of Hisashi's own barely hidden embarrassment. Izuku rushed over to the door of the bakery, struggling to pull it open on his own. Hisashi surreptitiously helped by tugging at the top of the door, out of Izuku's line of sight, and allowed the child to dart inside. "Tanaka-san! Tanaka-san!" Izuku chirped happily, bouncing up and down as he ran over to the counter. "Tanaka-san!" Inside voice, "Izuku," Aizawa chided, and Hisashi elbowed the other man gently. "Let the kid be a little excited," Hisashi whispered, and Aizawa rolled his eyes. "He can be excited without bursting any eardrums." "Oh, I have plenty of experience with bursting eardrums, dude. And little guy isn't even close." "Tanaka-san." Izuku called once more, his voice at a slightly lower tone than before, but still loud enough for the baker in the back to hear. "I hear you, buddy." Tanaka called back with a laugh. "Give me just a moment, kiddo." True enough, only a few moments later, an older brunette man with kind eyes and a short beard exited the back, holding a silver pan full of chocolate croissants. Izuku all but squealed, making Aizawa wince. "Okay," Hisashi acquiesced. "He's getting closer to eardrum-bursting levels now." But Tanaka was used to excited children, especially his favorite little customer, and instead of chiding Izuku, the man merely chuckled. Crouching down at the side of the counter, he nodded towards Izuku and then towards the pan. "Want a fresh one, Izuku-chan? Right out of the oven." "Be careful," Aizawa immediately spoke. "The pan will be hot." Izuku nodded at his father's warning, reaching forward with a tiny hand and plucking the fattest, most chocolatey croissant on the pan. Tanaka chuckled, standing up and turning back to the kitchen to place the pan on a cooling rack. When he re-emerged, Tanaka addressed Aizawa with a wide smile. "Aizawa, it's good to see you. It's been too long since you brought the little one over." And then, turning a slightly devilish grin towards Hisashi, the man inquired, "Who's your friend here?" Grateful that Izuku was too occupied with his croissant to answer for him, Hisashi replied, "Hisashi Yamada, It's nice to meet you, Tanaka-san. Likewise, Yamada-san. At that very moment, Izuku finished his large bite of croissant and chirped happily, Daddy and Yamada-san had a sleepover last night. Izuku-dash, Aizawa choked on a breath, coughing in surprise. Hisashi froze, feeling a blush spread over his cheeks and ears. He glanced over at Tanaka nervously, cursing the innocence and loose-tonguedness of children, fighting for words to say. But Tanaka took it all in a stride, merely snorting out a laugh and then saying, "Congratulations on your sleepover, Aizawa." Respectfully, Tanaka-san, get off. And then to Izuku, "Don't repeat that." "Okay, Daddy." Hisashi, once his brain caught back up with him, turned to the counter to look at the baked goods. It was absolutely not so that he wouldn't have to look at Aizawa's blushing face, inner Nemuri. There was a appealing arrangement of all sorts of pastries inside. Chocolate croissants, of course, but also cream puffs, fruit jelly danishes, and mochi donuts all sat prettily inside the case, along with so many others. "Wow," Hisashi spoke in awe. "What do you normally get, Aizawa?" Shrugging, hands shoved in his pockets, Aizawa replied, "Whatever Izuku and Tanaka suggest." "Well then," Hisashi exclaimed, turning towards Izuku, who, despite his large bites, was hardly a fifth done with his croissant. "What do you suggest, little listener?" Pursing his lips in thought, Izuku pressed his nose up to the pastry case, making Aizawa wince, and observed all of the baked goods available. After a few moments, the child leaned back and nodded firmly, addressing Tanaka with a loud, "Sakura mochi donut." "Sakura mochi donut it is, kiddo," Tanaka exclaimed right back, reaching down to grab one for Hisashi. "And for your father?" After repeating the previous exchange, Aizawa was left with a milk tea bun. When Aizawa reached down for his wallet, Hisashi stopped him. "I've got it." "But dash. Hey, you got the ice cream, I've got this, all right? No biggie." Aizawa looked like he wanted to protest, but fortunately, Izuku grabbed onto his father's hand, his own tinier hand only able to hold onto a few of Aizawa's fingers, and led the man off to a table to the back of the bakery. Hisashi watched fondly as Izuku tried to heft himself up onto a chair with one hand, his other clenching tight to his beloved croissant, and then continued to watch with growing amusement and a warmth in his chest and belly as Aizawa leaned down to tug his son onto the seat. "Take good care of him, all right?" came Tanaka's quiet voice. "Both of them actually. They deserve it after everything." Hisashi was too confused to be embarrassed, turning towards Tanaka with a curious glance. "What do you mean?" Tanaka shrugged as he rang up the pastries. "Not my story to tell. Just know this, Yamada-san." Tanaka's voice trailed off, and he looked up at Hisashi, studying his face as though Hisashi were a rather intricate painting or a map to be deciphered. "Their little family has been through rough times. But they're some of the best DMN people I've ever met. So please take care of them." Slowly, Hisashi nodded. Tanaka nodded back more firmly before handing over Hisashi's change. "Take care, Yamada-san," Tanaka said before turning to address the ringing bell at the front door, signaling the arrival of another customer. Still confused, Hisashi wandered over to the table where Izuku was regaling his father with a tale of their adventures at the park. Even though the man had been present, he hadn't known the whole backstory of Hisashi's and Izuku's hero-slash-villain game, and Izuku was dead set on making sure his father knew everything. Sitting down across from Aizawa and to Izuku's side, pressed up against the window, Hisashi took a bite of his donut, which was delicious, the nectar of the gods, and listened happily to Izuku's tales. It didn't take long, maybe halfway through his croissant, for Izuku to start lulling. His eyes drooped heavily, and his head bobbed as he tried to stay awake, slowly chewing the bite he'd taken through a wide yawn. Aizawa chuckled, tapping the boy's nose with a finger. Something about the domestic sight made Hisashi's head spin, and said, "Go get a box from Tanaka-san, Aizu. Then we can go home, okay?" Still chewing his bite, Izuku nodded, stumbling off his chair to go get a to-go box. Suddenly, unbidden, Hisashi blurted out, "You're really good with him." Raising an eyebrow back, Aizawa replied frankly, "I'd hope so. He is my kid." "No, but Hisashi began, for once in his life struggling to find words. Look, a lot of parents aren't the best. Something turned stony and familiar in Aizawa's face, but Hisashi pressed on. But you? You're so patient with him, even when you're annoyed. A lot of parents out there would scream or spank the kid or something like that. But you're really good with him. You listen to him, and you make sure he understands things. He's a smart kid. He is, Hisashi agreed. And I think part of that is due to great parenting. Aizawa was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixated on Izuku as the child swayed by the register, waiting for Tanaka to reappear from the back. Hisashi had a feeling that Aizawa was purposefully not meeting his eyes, but he didn't hold it against the man. Aizawa seemed to be that way with emotions, rather distant while still being able to handle them. It was a balancing act, one that Hisashi had yet to master himself. Finally, Aizawa replied quietly, "Thank you." Nothing more was said between the men as they waited for Izuku to stumble back over, his half of croissant now boxed up. Aizawa stood, and Izuku immediately raised his arms up to his father. Hisashi saw the exact moment that Aizawa's face melted, and if his head was spinning before, it was absolutely being throttled now. Because Aizawa was crouching down to lift Izuku up into his arms, perching the child on his hip as Izuku nuzzled his face into the man's shoulder. Hisashi leaned forward to take Izuku's box, patting the child's hand that was wrapped tightly around the collar of his father's shirt. "I think it's nap time," Hisashi chuckled, and Aizawa nodded back with a small smile. It was only a block back to their apartment. One measly, little, old block. A block that it shouldn't take more than a few minutes' time to walk. Soon enough, Shoyuta would be back at the apartment with Izuku, tucking his son in for a nap. And soon enough, Hisashi Yamada would be walking away, probably to never be seen again. Shoyuta could not ask the guy for his number, though. They'd probably text for a few days, maybe a few weeks, before Yamada realized what a recluse and antisocial person Shoyuta was and drop him completely. Not like it hadn't happened before. What would make Yamada any different? And yet, something deep in his gut screamed at Shoyuta. It told him that Yamada was different, that somehow, someway Yamada would worm his way into Shuta's heart, not that he hadn't already, and fester there for months. Maybe even years, if things went well. So, Eraserhead, Yamada drawled, moving to gently tug Izuku's hand from its death grip in Shuta's hair, relieving some of the pressure in Shuta's skull. And then, endearingly, the voice hero allowed the child to wrap his little hand around Yamada's forefinger, resting his palm on Shuta's shoulder. It sent shivers down Shuta's spine that he absolutely loathed to think Yamada may have felt. Where did that name come from? Shoyuta hesitated, but only for a moment. It's kind of dumb. Try me. With a sigh, Shoyuta looked up at the sky, which was just starting to turn orange with the promise of her appealing sunset, and chewed over his words carefully. Yamada stayed quiet, ever so patient, as he thought. When I was a kid, I was active in a lot of hero forums. Yamada nodded in understanding. I don't have an offensive quirk, and it's seen as villainous to most people. Yamada let loose an angry teach, but didn't interrupt to say more. So I took to hero forums to look for ideas, looking for support from others that I didn't get elsewhere. A small smile overtook Shuta's face as he remembered what happened next. And then my mother's adopted me. I was 10. Yamada's hand tightened briefly over Shuta's shoulder, more of a twitch than anything, although it told Shoyuta that the man related more than he let on. Shoyuta continued. They gave me all the support in the world, but my mothers are both terrible with names. A smaller, fonder smile. So I took back to the forums. There was this other kid on there, Loud Canary 5000, and he suggested the name Eraserhead. Yamada let out a small gasp, and his hand tightened further on Shuta's shoulder, tugging the dark-haired man around to face him. Yamada's eyes were wide in recognition, as if a memory had been slapped to the forefront of his mind suddenly. Wait, he started, looking all for that he needed to catch his breath even though they had barely been meandering. Your cat lover 39? Shuta's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his face settled into a small, smug smile. Sounds about right. Nice to finally meet you, Loud Canary. Oh, shut it. Cat lover? Really? Couldn't have picked out something cooler? Like what? Eraserhead? Used it. And you used present mic. Much better than presentation, Michael. Shut up, Yamada whined futilely, his face pinkening quite nicely. Hey, wait a second. Did you go to UA? All at once, Shoyuta felt his face shutting down. He turned away from Yamada, continuing on walking down the block. For all that he appreciated and enjoyed his time at Ketsubutsu, UA was still somewhat of a sore spot for him. I did, Shoyuta acquiesced. For almost a year. I transferred over to Ketsubutsu some time after the sports festival. Why? Yamada inquired, sounding rather plussed. UA is a great school. You would have done amazing dash. For all that it's an amazing school, Shoyuta interrupted, the board can't seem to get past the idea of villainous quirks. Even for kids who placed second in the sports festival. Yamada paused in his walk, and when Shoyuta looked over at him, the man had an indignantly rageful look on his face. That's bullshit, he huffed out, waving a hand in the air. And I say this with no respect, the school board. Be careful, Shoyuta teased, looking away so that Yamada couldn't see his sideways grin. You work for them, after all. Oh, they know we all hate them, Yamada continued on in a more chipper voice. Especially Minoru. Shoyuta couldn't help the small chuckle that left his lips. He'd heard of Minoru before, and he knew the man had a kid about Izuku's age. Poor sap of a child, having Minoru as a father. It's nice. Shoyuta cleared his throat, feeling suddenly embarrassed, to finally meet you. You were supportive, which was different than I was used to. Aizawa, Yamada started softly. Shoyuta, the other man interrupted. Yamada looked surprised. What? Call me Shoyuta. Yamada's face absolutely melted, and he reached his free hand out to squeeze Shuta's own. Then you call me Hizashi. Or Zashi. Either works, really. Zashi, Shoyuta said quietly, smiling more to himself than to Yamada. Hizashi, his brain supplied. Has a nice ring to it. Hizashi grinned, his smile splitting his face and looking brighter than sunshine. Thanks. I like Shoyuta. Can I call you Sho? Or how about Shosho, he teased. Something lonely tugged at Shuta's heart as he was reminded of Inko, and he grunted out, Shoyuta is preferable. Okay. Yamada relented. Shoyuta it is dash. Suddenly, a blaring alarm rang through the air, a high-pitched bell that had Hizashi wincing and reaching for his hearing aids. Izuku shot up, whining and looking about frantically. Shoyuta hushed his son, running a hand through the boy's curly hair, as he whipped around to look across the street. The small, unassuming bank that sat right across from their apartment was being robbed. Sheet. Shoyuta huffed out, turning to hand Izuku over to Hizashi. Hang on to Izuku for me, would you? He gets into trouble around hero fights. And where would you be? Hizashi countered even as he took Izuku into his arms. You don't have your support equipment, do you? What will you dash? You don't have your equipment either, Shoyuta fought back. And my quirk is a little less destructive without mine. A wince. No offense. None taken. Just be careful, alright, Shoyuta? Shoyuta rolled his eyes, unsheathing a knife behind his back that Hizashi hadn't known was there. Right. Take care of Zuku, okay? Shoyuta crouched a bit to look into Izuku's eyes, kissing the boy's forehead briefly. Stay with Yamada-sen, Izuku? Hey daddy. Go get the bad guys. Izuku cheered, punching the air happily. With nothing more but a sideways grin, Shoyuta took off towards the bank, darting down an alleyway towards the back and out of Hizashi's line of sight. Hizashi wasn't panicking. He wasn't. Sure, Aizawa. Shoyuta had left Hizashi with his kid, entrusting the most precious of things to Hizashi while he went off to fight, but Hizashi could be responsible for a minute. Because it would only take a minute for Shoyuta to deal with some small-time crooks, right? Hizashi quickly took cover in a nearby alleyway, behind a dumpster. Izuku whined about not being able to see, but Hizashi had a slight view of the bank over the top of said dumpster, so he narrated what he could see. Which wasn't much, honestly. He heard shouting and screaming and gunfire coming from inside the bank, but he couldn't see much of anything. And then, the hostages were being released. Hizashi let loose a sigh of relief, because Shoyuta must have been able to take care of all the villains if the hostages were escaping, right? All at once, there was a rush of heat and light and wind that had Hizashi staggering backwards, shielding Izuku with his body behind the dumpster. His heart racing, brain thudding against his skull, Hizashi's head popped back up to get sight of the bank through clouds of smoke. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't. Shoyuta would obviously be fine because he was an amazing hero and, as the smoke cleared, Hizashi felt bile rise up in the back of his throat. Because only half of the bank kept standing after the FING bomb that had ripped through it. No! It took a few moments for Hizashi to register the screaming. His hearing aids were ringing in his ears after being so close to the explosion, staticky and screeching at him. Quickly, he turned them off even as he moved to crane his neck down at Izuku. Izuku, even though Hizashi could no longer hear him, was screaming his little head off. Tears were running down the child's splotchy cheeks like waterfalls, his mouth open and throat tensing as he wailed. It struck something deep in Hizashi's chest, seeing Izuku screaming like that. Hizashi tried to shush the child, trying to comfort him, but Izuku kept screaming. And then, Hizashi could see the child's lips moving as he sobbed out, "Daddy!" F-. Hizashi cursed, pressing Izuku's face to his shoulder. Because what the F was he supposed to do in this situation? He couldn't call the police at present, and Izuku was in no condition to do so, either, even with an adult's instructions. And yet, he couldn't go charging into the half-standing bank when he was currently in charge of Izuku. Why had Shoyuta put him in charge of Izuku? Sure, he'd been the only adult around at the moment, but Shoyuta could have just run Izuku back into the bakery. It was hardly a block behind them. But then again, he'd needed all the time he could have in order to get those hostages out. Hizashi? Really? Sure, he was good with kids. He had a plethora of nieces and nephews, not to forget Tensei's little brother, but Hizashi wasn't even Shuta's friend. Not yet. And somehow, Shoyuta still found it in him to trust Hizashi. But now, a hand suddenly grabbed Hizashi's shoulder, and he swung around with a fist raised. Izuku pressed into his side as he got ready to swing. There stood Tanaka, hands up in a surrendering pose. He said something, but Hizashi's brain was spinning too badly to be able to read his lips. Tanaka frowned, and Hizashi vaguely gestured to his hearing aids. Eyes lighting up in recognition, Tanaka signed. "Do you sign?" "Yeah," Hizashi replied with a short nod and brusque motion. "Give Izuku to me," Tanaka responded. "Aizawa needs you." In a normal situation, where his brain was functioning, Hizashi may have questioned how Tanaka knew he was a pro-hero. After all, Hizashi knew he was nearly unrecognizable out of uniform. Izuku was special to have recognized him like that. But this wasn't a normal situation, and Hizashi's brain was spinning like a broken record, so he handed Izuku over, wincing when the child's foot kicked out and hit his kidney. "I'll be back," Hizashi promised aloud and in sign. "Bring Aizawa with you," Tanaka signed back, holding Izuku tightly to his chest. "Please." And Hizashi's brain may have been spinning, but his heroic muscle memory knew exactly what to do. Without a second glance at the child in Tanaka's arms, he was safe with the baker. He was safe. Hizashi sprinted across the street towards the bank. He briefly noted seeing the flashing red and blue lights of a cop car nearby, but ignored them in favor of approaching the standing part of the bank. The front door had been rendered useless, and only the front left corner of the building remained standing. The blast had been large enough to take chunks out of the building on the right of it, but not strong enough to do much other damage to the surrounding streets. Hizashi ducked under a hanging support beam, pulling himself into the wreckage of the bank. He looked around, noting all of the debris that covered the floor. While the right wall of the bank was still half standing, the entirety of the roof had fallen inwards, leaving drywall and bricks and skeleton work of the building on the ground. Hizashi sidestepped the worst of it, keeping his eyes open for the villains who had attacked the bank in the first place. It wouldn't help Shoyuta if he got himself in a bad spot, now would it? And Hizashi found them. Two of them both armed to the teeth. But having guns and knives hadn't helped them when their own DMN bomb went off. It had likely been a last-ditch attempt to either get away or die and stay out of prison. If it had been an attempt to get away, though, it had backfired horribly. because both villains were absolutely blown to smithereens, blood and viscera coating the bricks around them. Hizashi gagged at the scent of iron, looking away from the chopped-up bodies and back out to the rest of the wreckage. If they looked like that, then Shoyuta... He couldn't think like that, because Shoyuta was too important. He had friends, Emi, and he had a son, Izuku, little Izuku, who was likely outside still screaming his tiny head off, and Shoyuta was too damn important to die. Hizashi was so distressed with his inner thoughts that he almost missed it. Really, it was a miracle he noticed it without his hearing aids on. But his eye caught sight of a flash of black amongst the pale gray smoke and dust. A black shoe, followed by a black sock and a black breathed leg. "Shoulda!" Hizashi shouted, rushing towards the fallen hero. He couldn't hear a response, but that didn't mean anything. Shoyuta could have been screaming right back, although somehow Hizashi doubted the man was much of a screamer. There was a large chunk of ceiling covering up Shuta's top half, and Hizashi, mustering up all of his strength, heaving with every muscle in his body, shoved it out of the way. Lying there, beneath the rubble, was a deathly still Shoyuta. Hizashi hissed, fuck. He scrambled for a pulse, collapsing to his knees beside the other man as he reached for Shuta's neck. For a few moments, Hizashi felt nothing. A sob built up in his chest and then, bump. Oh, thank F. Shuta's eyes were closed, his head lilted to the side as his chest rose and fell to the pulse of his heartbeat. For a moment, Hizashi allowed himself to close his eyes and sigh in relief. And then his eyes snapped back open with force. Because Hizashi Yamada was a hero. And he had a job to do. Leading the paramedics over to Shoyuta was easy enough, and sitting back to let them work was even easier. The hardest part was going back to Izuku and Tanaka. Hizashi left a quick statement with one of the officers there, a new guy named Sansa with the coolest mutant quirk, who also happened to know JSL rather well, to Hizashi's utter relief, and rushed back over to Izuku and Tanaka. Izuku had finally worn himself out with screaming, but was still sobbing into Tanaka's shirt. Watery eyes and snot bubbles greeted Hizashi when he went to rub Izuku's back, and the child jumped from Tanaka's arms to his with absolutely no prompting. Hizashi wasn't upset about it. Far from it. He could use a good Izuku hug right about now. Hugging Izuku tightly to his chest, feeling the child's warmth and shuddering sobs and heartbeat, Hizashi fished his cell phone out of his pocket and handed it to Tanaka. "Call Emi for me, please? Tell her what happened." "Emi," Tanaka confirmed, earning a nod, before he dialed. Hizashi could see the man mouth, "Hello, Miss Emi," before he turned his attention back down to Izuku. The child's eyes were lulling, and Hizashi was reminded that the boy was nearing nap time right before everything went south. What with the emotional roller coaster and the trauma he'd experienced that day, Izuku must have been exhausted. So, murmuring softly and rocking back and forth, Hizashi crooned to the little boy. Soft lullabies and nothings fell from his lips, his hands stroking through Izuku's sweat-dampened curls. Slowly but surely, Izuku's heaving sobs turned to hiccups, and then quickly to snores. Tanaka had wandered off a few feet to speak on the phone, but wandered back quickly and signed to Hizashi. "She said she's on her way. She'll be here in a few minutes." Looking over Hizashi's shoulder, Tanaka's eyes went wide. "Is he okay? They've got him on a stretcher, but—" "I don't know," Hizashi interrupted. "All I know is that he's alive." A sad smile filtered onto Tanaka's face, and he replied, "That's all that matters right now." Somehow, Hizashi wasn't so sure about that. It hardly took Emi 10 minutes to get to their location. Hizashi didn't know how she did it, especially since she was at her agency nearly 20 minutes away, but he didn't question it. Let Emi keep her secrets. It gave him a bit of time to mess with his hearing aids while Izuku slept in his arms, though, and he got them barely working enough to hear the woman's approach. "Zuzu," the woman chirped when she saw the little boy bundled up in Hizashi's arms. Tanaka had retreated to his upstairs apartment at the bakery and had come back down with a ratty tan blanket, offering it up to Hizashi to wrap Izuku in. Then, with a wise smile, Tanaka had bid them adieu to deal with his panicking customers. "Zuzu," Emi repeated, her voice still happy and upbeat even as Hizashi noticed the worry lines around her eyes. She was grinning, keeping up the facade for Izuku, but Hisashi could see it. She was worried. He was too, of course, but Emi was close with Shoyuta. Possibly the closest he had. This had to have been taking a toll on her. Even so, she smiled at her little nephew and tickled his tummy, drawing a wet and tired giggle out of the sleepy boy. "Hey, sweetie pie," Emi greeted for a third time. "Why don't we get you upstairs and into a bath, yeah? And then we can get you a change of clothes and a nap." Beeb dash, Izuku started, tears welling in his eyes. "But Daddy dash. Your daddy is in good hands, Zuzu," Emi crooned to the boy, brushing his bangs back and out of his face. "The doctors and nurses know what they're doing, okay, buddy? They'll take care of him." Sniffling, Izuku conceded to his aunt's point and relinquished his hold on Hisashi to be transferred over to her arms. Emi crooned a bit more to Izuku, gently holding onto the back of his head as he burrowed his face into her neck. Turning to Hisashi, Emi grinned, softer, weaker than before, and said, "You probably want a bath and a nap too. Still got my number, Yamada?" Mutely, Hisashi nodded. "Good. I'll keep you updated on Shoyuta, okay? For now, I think Izuku needs some family time." Family time? Of course. Hisashi had almost forgotten throughout the course of the day. He wasn't family. Of course he wasn't. Having a single night of fun with Shoyuta didn't entitle him to sheet, and just because Shoyuta had been inclusive and kind for most of the day didn't mean sheet either. Hisashi was just a stranger to them. Just a colleague to Emi. Nothing to Shoyuta. Nothing to Izuku. Numbly, Hisashi nodded again. "Be good, Izuku," he croaked, turning on his heel and walking down the street, away from Shuta's apartment. Sometime later, he hailed a cab. It was an astronomical fee to get him back to Mizutafu, but he paid it without blinking. Hands shoved into his pockets, eyes downcast towards the ground, Hisashi made his way to his apartment, going up the elevator and unlocking the door. His apartment was quiet. Silent. Deathly silent. Not even Noodles was meowing, fast asleep perched atop his scratching post. He was alone. Hands and knees shaking, stomach churning, brain throbbing against his skull, Hisashi pulled out his cell phone and hit speed dial. Hey, he stuttered once they picked up. I can't be alone right now. I'm on my way." Nemuri got to his apartment in mere minutes, letting herself in with her key. Which was good, because Hisashi was currently wrapped up under no less than 3 blankets and a weighted comforter, snuggled into the fetal position upwards on his couch. There was a TV show playing in the background, some pre-quirk cartoon, and both the ceiling fan and humidifier were on the highest settings. There was enough background noise that Hisashi, with or without his hearing aids in, would be successfully distracted. So, Nemuri drawled, slightly teasing and slightly worried, "You want to tell me what happened with Adonis, or dash?" A sob ripped its way out of Hisashi's chest, startling his friend. Immediately, Nemuri was crouched next to the man, asking what he needed. Water? Something stronger? A hug dash. Hug would be nice, Hisashi murmured, blinking back the tears that were swallowing up his vision. It wasn't even fair of him to be so upset. After all, he wasn't familiar with the Aizawas, so why was he so? Nemuri obliged him, of course, hugging the living daylights out of the blanket-clad man before turning to his kitchen. Nemuri made a wonderful cup of tea with her loose-leaf concoctions at her own apartment, but all Hisashi had at his place was bagged tea. Still, somehow, Nemuri managed to WHP together a honey-soaked cup of bliss for Hisashi to consume. "You've probably got a headache," Nemuri crooned to him, gesturing to his hearing aids. "Take those off if you want. I'm getting rusty on my JSL anyways." Which was a total lie. If anyone was rusty on their JSL, it was Tensei, but Nemuri was absolutely fluent and had been that way for years. So, Nemuri signed to him after setting their mugs of tea on the coffee table. She sprawled out on the couch next to Hisashi, forcing him to uncurl with her feet so that she could rest them on his lap. It was a simple touch, one that shouldn't have been as comforting as Hisashi found it. But he had always been a tactile person, being touch-starved as a child really morphed him into a touchy-feely adult, and just feeling the warmth of his friend next to him had the knot in his chest loosening slightly. Something happened with Adonis? The woman continued. Yeah, Hisashi replied. His throat grew tight, and his shaking hands struggled to sign out. There was a villain attack. Nemuri's eyes widened, and she leaned forward to emphatically sign, Are you okay? I'm fine. Shoyuta. His name is Shoyuta, he got hurt. Start from the beginning, Zashi. Nemuri signed to him firmly. And so he did. Hisashi told his friend everything. From the taxi ride to the park, to the dandelions, to playing heroes and villains with Izuku, to finding out Izuku was quirkless. He told her about Shuta's small smiles and the affection he held for his son. He told her about ice cream and chocolate croissants and small, teasing smiles. He told her about a bank, an explosion, finding Shoyuta, and Izuku's tears. When Hisashi was done, he was struggling to breathe, feeling like he'd sprinted 5 miles. Sometime during his tirade, Nemuri had started running her hands through his long hair, trying to get some of the small knots out. You got attached, she told him. When Hisashi went to protest, Nemuri continued on, There's nothing wrong with that. Not always. Sometimes, getting attached can be a good thing. Sometimes, the universe is on our side, and attachments can mean future blessings. I don't think the universe is on my side here, Nem, Hisashi retorted, feeling a little jaded. He's in the FNG hospital, and I didn't do a single FING thing to help him. But you did help him, Zashi. I could have done more. Could've, would've, should've. Nemuri flicked her hand in the air haphazardly. We all have regrets, Zashi. But don't let allowing Shoyuta and Izuku to slip through your fingers by some misplaced sense of guilt become a regret. Because you've gotten attached, and you will regret letting them go. Hisashi inhaled, and the spinning of his head steadied itself some with the deep breath he let out. Nem, how do you know me so well? Because I'm the best. Make sure you tell Tensei. Snorting out a laugh, Hisashi shook his head. Sorry, but I don't have favorite friends. Yes, you do, you liar. Don't have favorite students, don't have favorite friends. Nope, nope, nope. I'm revoking your kitten privileges. Hisashi gasped, hand flying to his chest as he leveled a shocked expression at the woman. You wouldn't. Smirking, sitting up straighter, Nemuri taunted. Aoi. You're no longer allowed to catsit lady. Only Tensei now. Tensei's allergic to her. He can learn to deal. He thinks cats are all demons. They are. Cute, fluffy little demons. After a beat of silence, the two friends burst into laughter, leaning against one another as they cried happy tears. A few minutes later, once Hisashi had calmed down and caught his breath, he turned back to Nemuri. What would I do without you? Crash and burn a fiery death, the woman replied shortly with no remorse. Harsh, but true. So, did you get his phone number? Hisashi deadpanned. Nem, I doubt he'll be texting from the hospital. You're right. And then, it hit Hisashi. He may not be able to contact Shoyuta, but he did have a certain jokester's phone number. But I think I know a way to fix that. His daddy was sleeping. Auntie Joke had said his daddy was hurt really, really badly, and that he needed a lot of sleep to get better. But Izuku didn't want his daddy to sleep. He looked so uncomfortable on the little bed that the nurses and doctors had put him on. He was covered in bandages and he had a thick cast on his leg. When Izuku had reached for the blankets to pull himself up onto the bed, right before his Auntie Joke pulled him into her lap and cooed for him to sit with her, he'd felt how scratchy the blankets were. His daddy couldn't be comfortable laying on them. His daddy had really, really, really soft blankets at home, and he had a blanket that was really heavy. Izuku liked to crawl under it to scare his daddy when he came out of the bathroom. He doesn't think his daddy was ever really scared, but he always got a little smile on his face and ruffled Izuku's hair. Why won't daddy wake up? Izuku sniffled, feeling overwhelmed. So much had happened that day already, and it was only nap time. He'd met Present Mike. From Put Your Hands Up, radio that he and his daddy listened to all the time. And they'd gone to the park. They went and saw Mr. Tanaka-san and they'd just been heading home to nap when... It's nap time, Zuzu, Auntie Joke told him, rocking him back and forth and running her fingers through his hair. Take a nap, baby. Maybe your daddy will be awake when you wake up. It'll be like a little present, getting to talk to him, yeah? Daddy's not comfy, Izuku protested. And Spork isn't here. Daddy cuddles with Spork when he naps. And Daddy doesn't have his sleeping bag. Or his bee blankets. Izuku began to stutter, breath hitching and tears welling in his eyes. Naniji, he needs dash. Zuzu, baby, you need to breathe, okay? Take a deep breath, kiddo. Your daddy's gonna be fine, okay? But it was too much. Everything was too much. The lights in the hospital were bright, and the explosion and the sirens had been loud, and Present Mike had saved his daddy, but now Present Mike wasn't here, so his daddy wasn't safe because Present Mike wasn't there to save him if something else happened. Zuzu, Izuku. Breathe, kiddo, breathe, nurse. I need a nurse. Auntie Joke had set him down on the bed next to his daddy, and she had stuck her head into the hallway to scream. Izuku, his chest still hitching painfully, black spots appearing in his eyes, turned sideways to curl into his daddy's hand. He grabbed his hand with both of Izuku's own, hugging it to his chest tightly. The spots in his eyes got bigger and bigger, and then there were hands on his shoulders, tugging him away from his daddy. And then Izuku fell asleep. As he made his way to the hospital, Hisashi's brain was racked with worries. What if Shoyuta didn't want to see him? What if he was mad at Hisashi? What if Izuku was mad at Hisashi? He should have done more. Why hadn't he done more? It was a long cab ride to the hospital from Yuzutafu, but when Hisashi finally arrived, he felt a wave of calm wash over him. Because even if Shoyuta didn't want to see him, if Izuku didn't want to see him, he'd still have closure. He could either kindle something new or put this whole situation behind him. He really hoped it didn't end up the latter, though. Walking into the hospital, Hisashi walked by the gift shop and then did a double take. Should he bring flowers? Shoyuta didn't seem like the flower type, but Hisashi couldn't just show up empty-handed. That would be worse than not showing up in the first place. And so, dragging out his wallet, Hisashi entered the gift shop. A few fretful minutes later, and after some assistance from the kind teenager running the shop, Hisashi exited with his purchases. Making his way to the front desk, he signed in before beginning to head towards the room Emi had given him the number 4. When he got to the room, Hisashi had to steel himself for a moment. Standing there, gift bags in hand, he took a deep breath to steady himself. And then, Hisashi knocked. After a beat of silence, in which there was no answer, no call through the door and no footsteps approaching it, Hisashi knocked again, a little louder. Still, there was no answer. Hisashi frowned, wondering if he got the room number correct. A quick glance at his phone told him, yes, he'd gotten the number right. And so, biting his lower lip, Hisashi gently turned the doorknob and poked his head in through the doorway. He saw Shoyuta. Shoyuta, who was lying in bed, attached to several monitors with a multitude of bandages wrapped around his limbs and head. A shuddering breath left Hisashi's lungs, and he slowly, cautiously, approached the bedside chairs. Setting his gift bags off to the side, Hisashi sat down in one of the chairs and turned to face Shoyuta. Even unconscious, the man was appealing. Long, dark lashes brushed against pale cheeks. His hair, as matted as it was dark and curly, framing his face perfectly. Appealing, Hisashi mumbled, unable to stop himself. And then Shoyuta moved. Groaning, the man blinked and turned his head from side to side, blearily searching the room. And then, when his eyes fixated on Hisashi, he grumbled out, Zashi? Breathlessly, Hisashi replied, yeah. Shoyuta blinked a few more times, trying to get a grasp on everything before he croaked out, Zuku? Where is Izuku? I don't know, Hisashi answered truthfully. I just got here. He and Emi must have stepped out to get food or something. And then it hit Hisashi that this may be the first time Shoyuta had woken up, and that he should probably call for a doctor. Hitting the bedside button, he quickly relayed to the nurse that Shoyuta was awake, and she replied that she was on her way. Sitting back down, Hisashi turned to Shoyuta and asked, how are you feeling? Like I got hit by a bus. The pause. 2 buses. Despite himself, Hisashi couldn't help but chuckle. Yeah. Getting blown up will do that to you. I've had my fair share of close calls like that. An awkward silence filled the air. Clearing his throat, Hizashi said, I got something for you. And something for Izuku, of course. But I got you something. Sheepishly, blushing light pink, he quickly stammered out. It's just a little thing and it's more a GG gift than anything, but I didn't know what else to get, but I couldn't show up with nothing so I dash. What is it? Shoyuta asked, interrupting Hizashi's spiel but not sounding judgmental. If anything, he sounded touched. Which was an uncharacteristic thing for the man, as Hizashi had learned over the past 24 hours, but was far from unwelcome. Here, Hizashi said, pulling up the bag. And then from out of it he tugged a large, stuffed gray tabby cat. Shoyuta snorted at the sight of it, then grunted under the weight when Hizashi handed it to him. It's weighted, the voice hero explained, for anxiety and stuff like that. I figured it would be nice to cuddle with, and if you didn't like it, Izuku probably would. You can heat it up in the microwave too. Well, that's a little morbid, was Shuta's chuckled response, even as he perched the cat up on his shoulder. Putting a cat in a microwave. Yeah, I guess it is, huh? Hizashi chuckled right back, brushing a strand of hair out of his face. And then, shocking the blonde, Shoyuta said bluntly, You're appealing. Hizashi's pale pink blush suddenly turned bright red, and he stammered out, That's the D-Drags talking. Maybe, Shoyuta replied, shrugging non-committally before wincing at the motion. But I don't say things I don't mean. Even when drugged up. Hizashi stammered a little bit, squeaking as he grasped for words. Fortunately, he was saved from his embarrassed misery by a nurse knocking on the door and entering. Hello, Mr. Aizawa, she greeted the man. And hello, Mr. Guest. Yamada, Shoyuta grunted out for Hizashi. Name's Yamada. Mr. Yamada, then, the nurse grinned. Now, Mr. Aizawa, how are you feeling? They ran through a standard examination, the nurse taking down notes and making small talk with Hizashi as she ran through Shuta's vitals. As the nurse was changing a few of Shuta's bandages, the man's eyes wandered towards the open door. Emi and Izuku should be back by now, he grumbled, sounding a bit hurt. Maybe they got caught up at the cafeteria? Hizashi offered. Oh, the nurse exclaimed, then turned concerned eyes towards Shoyuta. I'm so sorry, Mr. Aizawa, it slipped my mind for a moment. Your son had to be checked into a room, and Miss Emi went to accompany him. Checked in? Shuta's voice was tense, and he quickly pushed himself up on his cot. What do you mean, checked in? Is he okay? Hizashi exclaimed, knuckled turning white as he gripped the edge of the hospital bed. I mean, he seemed fine earlier, but did something happen? The doctor can tell you more, the nurse began hesitantly, but for now, please know that he will be fine. He was slightly dehydrated and had a panic attack that rendered him unconscious for a few moments. He's being taken care of, I promise you that. I need to see him, Shoyuta grunted, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. When he went to stand, though, his knees buckled. The nurse let out an exclamation, rushing to put down the bandages that were busying up her hands, but Hizashi was quick to grab Shuta's arms and support him. Hey, there dash, Hizashi started. You need to calm down, Shoyuta. She said Izuku's fine. Yeah? Just a little dehydrated. You need to stay in bed dash. I need to see my son, Shoyuta growled right back, earning a disapproving pet eyebrow from Hizashi. Yeah, okay, and how are you gonna get there? Walking? Shoyuta, you can't even stand. And then, quickly, before the other man could protest more, Hizashi said, Let me go check on him for you, yeah? I'll FaceTime you so that you can see him, okay? But please, Shoyuta, think about yourself too. You can't help Izuku if you're injuring yourself further. Shoyuta was silent for a moment, seemingly chewing over Hizashi's words. But finally, he acquiesced, sitting back down on the cot, to the nurse's obvious relief, and leaned back against the pillows. Give me your phone. I'll give you my number. Izuku had been placed in the children's ward on the other side of the hospital. As Hizashi made his way over, he tested out the FaceTime with Shoyuta to make sure it was working. Hizashi entertained the man with commentary on the obscure cartoon art that decorated the walls of the children's ward, and Shoyuta rolled his eyes every once in a while in response. When he got to Izuku's room, Hizashi knocked on the door quietly, just in case the boy was asleep. It was Emi who answered the door, looking a little worse for wear but still smiling. "Yamada!" she exclaimed. "Hey, Zuzu, look who came to visit you." "Mr. Yamada." The little boy's weak chirp came from the bed. Hizashi slumped a little in relief at hearing it, knowing that Izuku was conscious and relatively okay coming as a huge relief. "Hi, Mr. Yamada. Did you come to see me and Daddy?" "Sure did, little listener. In fact, I have someone here who wants to say hi." When he turned his phone around to face Izuku, Hizashi got a bit of heaven in his ears hearing the little boy's excited squeal. "Daddy! Daddy!" Izuku cheered, tears welling in his eyes. Hizashi handed the phone over, and Izuku pressed his face up near the camera, eyes still on his father's face. "You're awake. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Zuku." Shuda's voice came from over the phone. "How are you feeling, kiddo? They told me you were dehydrated and fainted." "I'm okay, Daddy. The nurses are really nice. And Auntie Joke has been giving me a lot of apple juice." "Izuku!" Emi protested. "You weren't supposed to tell him I'm spoiling you, kiddo." "Oh, Auntie Joke isn't spoiling me, Daddy." Shuda's deep chuckles filled the room, and Hizashi felt the sound chipping away at his heart. "A little juice is fine for today, Zuku. The sugar will help you feel a little better anyways." And then, to Emi, Shoyuta said, "Emi, what did the doctor say about his status?" While Emi took the phone from Izuku, reiterating everything the doctor had said about Izuku's health, Hizashi turned to the boy with his gift bag. "Hey kiddo. I got you a little something if you want to see it." Izuku's gaze was tugged away from Hizashi's phone, instead turning to the man himself at the mention of a present. "Why yeah," the little boy chirped happily. What is it? Why don't you open it and see?" Hizashi teased as he set the bag on the boy's lap. Izuku reached into the bag, face contorted in confusion, and tugged out a hefty piece of fabric. Unfolding it as best he could with his limited range of motion and small arms and with a little help from Hizashi, Izuku peered at the soft fabric for a few moments. And then promptly screeched. "Izuku!" Shuda's worried voice called out. Emi looked up from the phone and let out a belting laugh at Izuku's excited state. "He's fine, Sho," she said, turning the phone to where the man could see his son. "Yamada got him a gift." It took a moment for the phone to register the blanket Hizashi and Izuku were holding up, but once it did, everyone in the room heard Shuda's deadpanned, "Great. Thanks, Hizashi." The blanket in Izuku's tight grasp had All Might's face emblazoned upon it, along with his old-school mantra, "Plus Ultra," in the background. The red and yellows were gaudy and tacky, and Izuku couldn't have loved it more. "Thank you, Mr. Yamada. I love it." Izuku squealed, hugging the blanket tightly to himself. Thank you." "Of course, Izuku. I had to get something for my favorite little listener, didn't I?" I'm your favorite?" Izuku gasped dramatically, looking starstruck. And, of course, Hizashi didn't have favorite students or favorite friends. But definitely he had favorite listeners. Because Shoyuta and Izuku listened to his show, Izuku had said as much, and they'd wormed their ways into Hizashi's heart in a way that no one else had before. "Of course you are, little guy," Hizashi all but crooned. "You and your dad are my favorite listeners." "I'm offended," Emi snorted. "Do you even listen to my show?" "No, but I'm still offended." Hizashi rolled his eyes, turning to steal his phone from Emi so that Shoyuta could be closer to his son. "Alright, let's catch your dad up on the newest All Might and Super Friends episode, yeah, Izuku?" "Yeah." Shoyuta was discharged 3 days after Izuku, a full 4 days after the bombing. Hizashi, having been a staple at the man's bedside before and after work, he was always there. He spent the night a few times, took care of Izuku, snuck in good food for Shoyuta to snack on, was there to escort Shoyuta home, despite the underground hero's attempts to insist he could walk on his own. His right leg was still casted, as was his left arm, and there were scabs all over his face and a scarred gash on his temple. Hizashi had just looked at Shoyuta, that same no-bullshit teacher look he gave his rowdier students, and Izuku mimicked the look, "My God," and then Shoyuta folded. "Fine," he grumbled. "Carry me out like a princess, for God's sake." And so, Hizashi did just that, scooping Shoyuta up out of his wheelchair and bridle carrying him to the car. Shoyuta sputtered and protested the whole way, and Izuku skipped after Hizashi, his hand clasped in Emi's, as he giggled brightly. It was a good day. Unfortunately, Emi had a late patrol shift that night, so it left Hizashi alone with Shoyuta and Izuku. Not unfortunately, Izuku filled all of the short gaps of silence with questions and theories, his words mixing and blending together until he dissolved into muttering that had Shoyuta smirking and Hizashi laughing. The boy blushed and his father ruffled his hair. "You're good, kiddo," he reassured the boy, who dissolved into mutters once more. But then it was Izuku's bedtime. Hizashi was given the honors of reading him his bedtime book, a few chapters out of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, an apparent old favorite of Shuda's, and then tucked Izuku's legs in under the blanket, seeing as how Shoyuta couldn't with one hand. It was entirely domestic, and Hizashi loved every second of it. When he sat down on the floor, across the coffee table from where Shoyuta sat on the couch, Hizashi breathed out, "I'd like to date you." Shoyuta froze, and then there was silence as the man thought over his next words carefully. "I don't typically do things casually, Zashi," he said quietly, looking down at the floor. For all that Shoyuta radiated confidence, he seemed so unsure now. "I have a kid to think of." "A kid who I adore," Hizashi reassured the other man. "And I can tell. You're a passionate person underneath that apathetic exterior, Shoyuta." Shoyuta snorted. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "Shush. I'm not done." Taking a deep breath, Hizashi continued, "Shoyuta Aizawa, for all that I've known you over the past 5 days, I've grown to care about you. A lot. I don't know if it's love, but I know that it's serious and it's real. I'm attached. I would never do anything to intentionally hurt you or Izuku, and I am so ready to do things not casually. So, please, if you want to go on a date with me?" Shoyuta was quiet once more. And then, looking up from the carpet, he leaned across the coffee table, Hizashi meeting him halfway, and gently, softly kissed Hizashi's lips. It was a brief kiss, but it was one that sent fireworks through Hizashi's brain. But there were no butterflies in his stomach. No, because Shoyuta didn't make him nervous. Shoyuta felt like home. This domesticity, this gentleness, this calmness. Even with the fire that burned in Shuda's eyes when they pulled away, Hizashi felt a sense of calm. Because he was finally where he belonged. "Want to spend the night?" Shoyuta inquired. And then, blushing, he quickly said, "Innocently, I mean. I just sleeping over." Hizashi snorted, giggling a bit manically. "Dude, I've essayed your D-dash. I don't think innocently can describe our relationship." "Shut up, Yamada, Jesus Christ dash." Hizashi shushed Shoyuta with another kiss, this one slightly deeper, leaving Shoyuta racing to catch his breath. "Yes. I will spend the night, Shoyuta." The morning after was even more peaceful than the night before. Hizashi woke up early, even though he didn't have to be at work or the station, and cooked a Western-style breakfast for Izuku and Shoyuta. Izuku was thrilled at the pancakes, and Shoyuta devoured the bacon and eggs. When Hizashi teased him about it, he cited hospital food having tortured him for the past 4 days. Sitting at the table, holding Shuda's hand next to his thigh, their fingers interlocked, Hizashi couldn't help but think he wouldn't rather be anywhere else. Shoyuta Aizawa wasn't a man of many words. And as such, he sat at breakfast eating silently, his casted arm angled beneath the table so that he could wrap his uncovered fingertips around Hizashi's hand. Sitting there, Shoyuta listened to his son ramble about the nutritious benefits of pancakes, highly misleading information, but still with root in fact, just like only Shuda's kid could do, while Hizashi countered with a debate on eggs. Izuku thought for a moment and then took a bite of his own eggs, saying aloud, "Only if they've got cheese on them." Shoyuta couldn't help but snort, and Hizashi laughed aloud. It was that same bright, twinkling laughter that had drawn Shoyuta to him at the bar so many nights ago. Bright and sunshine-y, filling the room and some empty cavern that Shoyuta hadn't realized resided in his chest. Sitting here, with his son, with Hizashi, Shoyuta didn't have to say it aloud. Because he knew that Hizashi understood. There was nowhere else Shoyuta would rather be.